Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I am grateful to be joined today by Kirsten Tyrell. Kirsten is an entrepreneur mom of three who homeschools in Southern Utah. She's the host of the Unshakable Confidence Podcast, where she helps women of faith flourish in motherhood, business, and beyond. Kirsten finds her greatest joy in helping women remember who they are and claim their divine identity so that they can accomplish their life mission. She believes in truly unshakable confidence that comes when we are rooted in our identity as children of God. Kirsten has built multiple successful businesses over the past 15 years and coaches women to level up and build sustainable success. She loves traveling the world, reading historical and business books, and singing with her family. Kirsten, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Megan. I'm so excited to be here.
For sure. We've been trying to get together like literally for over a year.
hmm
But I am a big believer in that podcasts, especially they happen when the Lord needs them to happen. So
Yep,
it took a little while, but we're finally here, and I think the moment is right. So thank you
I
for being
agree.
with us.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about your ministry, the Unshakable Confidence podcast, and how it is that God led you to the place that you're in today?
Yeah. And it starts a little bit, this goes back a long time, right? Because he's constantly doing a work with us. And sometimes most of the time, we don't see what he's doing and how he's guiding that and what he's creating along the way. And I would say that while this started years and years and years ago, like I said, I've been doing business for 15 years. The major moment really came this year in February when my dad passed away unexpectedly. He had a heart attack and it was completely unexpected. Not just his health was completely fine, but just in the middle of the night. And it was really devastating for my family, but it's just as any hard thing leads to beautiful experiences, this definitely has. And it was really a point where I looked at everything differently. I had studied a lot of things about what happens when we die. Like, I have this faith, I have this religious belief that tells me that this is an eternal experience and that I'm going to see my dad again. But in the meantime, what's he doing? Like, what does this look like? And how do I have a relationship with him? And what am I supposed to do in the meantime? Because it's just, in some ways, for me, it made life feel really trivial. Like, we have this big thing we get to do next after this life, but what is really the point here? And what am I going to do that's going to prepare me to see my dad again and make sure that we're together? And am I using the time that I have here as effectively as I possibly can? So it was just a major wake up, even though I wasn't living life in such a way that I was removed from the light of Christ and I wasn't like living this crazy life. It was still just this wake up of what are we doing? What's the purpose of it? And why are we doing it? And so there's something significant about having somebody you knew so well, somebody so close to you. And this was my first time experiencing death where it wasn't a grandparent or a distant relative, to really understand and believe they're on the other side. And now we can tag team. And I have this person that I know well, who I know knows me, and we can work together and I can draw on that help and that support. And so I really acted on that faith. And ever since then, I have started doing more day to day, big things, little things that are, I think, more in alignment with a bigger vision of the life that I want to create. I think it moved me out of a reactive state into a very proactive state of living. And so that was a really massive shifting point for me, to where everything I've done since then has really been very intentional and trying to work towards something and have a much bigger vision for my life. And that's also led me to stop compartmentalizing my faith, my relationship with Christ, and business and my goals over here, my earthly goals and then my spiritual goals. And it's really come together to become this message that, even more recently in the last few months, like, we have to stop. I have to personally stop putting God in a box over here, and it's got to be a part of my message. I have to share that the major thing that has always shifted me and helped me to feel joy and helped me to feel peace and accomplish anything that I've done has always been Jesus Christ. So why am I leaving him out of the conversation? So that's kind of what's gotten me to now, where my podcast started 9 years ago. It started as Marvelous Moms Club, and it's taken on so many different names and iterations since then. And it's mostly been the same message, though. That's the funny thing, is I've always felt this call to remind women not to let go of this beautiful dream and this beautiful vision they had for their lives. When motherhood gets hard, you start having babies, you start to lose sight of, oh, well, that was just a hopeful dream. That was just the ideal. I can't have that. And I think when we know who we are, it changes what we do. And so for the last 9 years, that's really what I've been doing. And now I think bringing God and Christ more into that message is just, it's completing the picture. And it's actually making it so much easier to create the impact that I want to create and to connect with the women that I'm supposed to connect with.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing your story. I think that it's so poignant and so personal, and thank you for being vulnerable and sharing some of the experiences that you've had. I can't imagine how hard that must be to have had your dad pass away and have that be a wake up call. I imagine it's very bittersweet,
Mhm.
and like very bitter and very sweet.
Yeah.
And so thank you for sharing that. While you were talking, I was just thinking kind of this principle of movement from being religious to being spiritual. And usually we look at those as like kind of diametrically opposed things. Or we think that they're automatically the same. And I would contend that it is actually a progression, that we
Mhm.
start with religion. It's almost like this law of Moses, right? Like I need this framework to tell me how to do life and what I believe and how to operate in the world, right? Like we need that. And then as we progress spiritually, as we grow, God does give us these opportunities to step into a broader space where things are not quite that clear cut, but reality is more integrated. Like things aren't as compartmentalized as you said.
Mhm.
I had someone who was asking me about, my process with managing life and managing my ministry and my discipleship. And as I was contemplating how to describe these things, like what came out of me is that it's all spiritual. Like it all becomes spiritual once we are moving in this pattern of spiritual development. The lines between what is secular and what is spiritual really start to fade, and you start to see that this is all a part of that grander plan. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, sometimes I think it does take a big wake up call to have us really evaluate and say, okay, this is what my religion has given me as a framework, but how do I experience that in my life? And that's kind of stepping into that realm of spirituality. Um, what other experiences have you had, if you wouldn't mind sharing, in relation to your ministry, that have helped you see kind of this evolution that we experience? Maybe we can say, as women, as moms, that is really powerful when we start to move away from like this religious kind of masculine framework of life into a more fluid and a broader sphere, a broader plane of perspective.
I mean, unfortunately, it's that whole scripture, right? It's better if we don't have to be compelled to be humble, but for me, I think most of the time that's where it stems from. So my natural instinct is to say I can go back to a lot of different challenges and trials that have really helped it move from this religious to this very spiritual approach to life. And we all have them. We've had so many of them. And my husband kind of teased and laughed because probably just a few days before my dad died, I was saying, I feel like I'm a little bit disconnected from the spirit. I feel like I need some more nourishment. I need to be seeking. I need to do a little bit more. I'm getting a little bit complacent. And I had said that years before when we had this massive challenge that came into our lives. And he was like, when are you going to learn to stop asking for hard things to happen?
Mhm.
Oh, but I think we just know that growth really does happen. The challenge is the way. It's not the thing that's in the way. It really is the way that we grow closer to Christ. And I think for me, it's been recognizing in those moments. I mean, even small moments. Like I remember being out on a jet ski once and at first being really mad that the cold water was splashing. And I was like, oh, if the water could just be warm. And then I stopped for a minute in the middle of the lake and I looked around and I just had this profound thought, this prompting, this knowledge, this sense of knowing of you waited forever to come and have this experience. You waited forever to have a body that could experience the cold and the warmth. And you get to behold all of the beauty of this earth. And this was all created for you. And so I stopped looking at the challenges and the negative things and just the minor inconveniences as in the way of me having a life experience and understanding that is the life experience. And when we're in those and when we're fully immersed in those and we're aware, then I think it's that oneness, right? We become one with everything around us. We become one with Christ. And I think that is really the starting point to a lot of moving out of just the religious framework where I was such a rule follower and also not, right? Like I also went through my rebellious teenage phase where I felt like I was living this double life. I was going to church, I was going to seminary, and then I was also doing some things that were less than ideal. And it was such a confusing thing for me because it was like I know who I am. I know I'm a good person, right? I know I love Christ. I know that I want this in my life, and it feels like I'm not spiritual or I'm not great and I could be better because according to the rule book I'm not keeping all the rules perfectly. And I think it's taken my whole entire life of moments of having to wake up, right? It's these wake up calls again and again and again when I went through something really hard in business. My business really crumbled and fell apart, and I had to ask, like, well, who am I without these labels? Who am I without this success? And what does God mean when he talks about seeking after the kingdom of God first? And what does that really mean to me? Well, how does that apply to my life? And what does that look like in my personal relationship? And so I can't necessarily put my finger on all these specific instances, but I know that it's been just a progression and it's been event after event of making the gospel very personal instead of this blanket thing. And I think it's really exciting the more that I've done that because now when I read scriptures, yes, these are stories, they're familiar, they're people that I've grown to love as I read these over and over again. And now I love things like The Chosen because you're reminded these are actual people. And when we read about Christ performing this miracle or helping these people with their weak faith, I now see myself in that. And so it's moved from this thing I do on Sunday, and I'm trying to really drive this home in my home with my children too, of we talk about not having contention and having peace. What does that look like in our home? It's not just when everything's going great. It has to be in the moments when you're really upset. What does it mean to be Christ like when you're really upset that your brother wouldn't let you go put the dog away or wouldn't let you have his blanket? You know what I mean? So I don't know if that directly answered your question, but I think for me, it's just a constant evolution of asking questions and trying to make the whole experience personal because it is. My experience here is meant to be personal. It's meant to take this framework and apply it and see what it means in the nitty-gritty corners of my life.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this is a little bit silly, but there's a TV show that my husband and I enjoyed watching, and it's a comedy. And there's this one scenario where the family is asked to take someone in, and the dad doesn't really want to do it, but he's like, "No, we're gonna do it because we're Christian, and my wife insists that we act like one." And it's just so funny. But it's really this whole concept of like there is a difference between being religious by ascribing to the tenets of a religion and using that as a framework for belief and life and living your religion. And that's when you're stepping into that space of like, no, this isn't just an ethereal thing that I think or believe. It's not even just a principle that I use to guide me when it comes to religious matters. It is my life, it is my
Mm-hmm.
identity, it is how I interact with God and everything around me. I love how you said that the challenge is the way. I think that that's so important, especially for women and for mothers. I've had women reach out to me and say, "How do you prioritize spiritual development? Like I'm drowning in babies and it's frustrating because I feel like they're getting in the way. I feel like they are inhibiting me from coming unto the Savior." And the truth of the matter is, especially when we look at the feminine, at the divine feminine, at that side of God, there is flexibility there. And there is room for each of us to have our own experience, and motherhood is that experience. Like that is the sanctifying power. That is the thing that God has introduced that we wanted to bring into our life to help us learn this lesson of how do I move beyond the check boxes, the prescribed ways of doing things, into a true, honest, genuine, lived religion. And that is messy. That is scary. It's outside of the box. People are really uncomfortable with that because it's way easier to be like, oh, check, I read my scriptures. I'm a good person, right? And it's way harder to say, I didn't read my scriptures, but I did have patience with my child when I really was tempted not to, right? And like
Yeah.
that is what God is looking for. That is what God is looking for more than the reading the scriptures and the saying the prayers, like the routine things, right?
I know. And I feel like there's so many regrets I have looking back, and I try to learn from those. And I love that you bring that up because it's so true. I had a podcast talking to moms, and I was in the thick of those mommy years where they were all 5 and under and we were in diapers and it was hard. And I think it goes back to that cliche of, right, like the dishes will wait, babies don't keep. And that still just feels a little bit like, but I have all these things I need to do. I have
But I
this big
want to do the
life I'm meant
dishes.
to live. Yeah, I want to do the dishes.
It's
And
easier
I
to do the
think,
dishes. There's like a measurable thing there to be
yes.
like, okay, I did the dishes, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like raising my children, what are the guideposts on that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's so much harder. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. No, and there's no end accomplishment. This is actually a reason that I've always encouraged women to have goals and have dreams within motherhood too, because you need to have those things that you feel like you can accomplish in several months or a year, because you're going to be raising those babies for a really long time. And even after they're adults, they're still going to be on your mind and your heart. There's no like end point where you've completed it.
Mhm.
I lie to myself and tell myself there is, because I'm more than halfway done with the until they're 18. But I know that's not true. It's never going to end. I think though, when it comes back to the reason that we can get a little bit, I don't know, focused and worried about not checking the check boxes is what I said earlier. You have to make it personal. What is your personal vision for what it means to be close to the Savior in this season of your life? Not always looking forward to, well, that has to mean that I have an hour of, you know, waking up at 4 in the morning to read my scriptures and journal. Like I tried that. I did the whole miracle morning thing several years ago. And what it turned out to be is me having to start waking up at 3:30, because when I woke up at 4, my kids woke up at 4. And I just felt like, see, I can't have this. I can't have my spiritual time. I can't have meditation time. When now I look back and I'm thinking, there was so much opportunity to do that without it being compartmentalized and put on this perfect schedule. Because even just sitting there holding my baby while she was nursing or playing with my kids was a beautiful time for meditation, to just live fully. And I think we get a little bit confused thinking it has to look a certain way, where if we take the time to plan what that means, not even in a detailed way of, well, when does meditation fit or when does this fit? And we just think about, what is it supposed to feel like? What am I searching for in my relationship with Christ? What is that going to look like? How will I know, right? If we don't have something that we're yearning towards, we'll never know if we've actually accomplished it. And so personal vision is a very important aspect of applying religion and having this full integration of the gospel into your life, because it's not supposed to look the same. We don't look the same. Our lives don't look the same. Why are we thinking our worship and our relationships with Christ are supposed to look the same?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, in my book that's coming out here in November, this is one of the things that I talk about is that the feminine spirit, our spirits, right? The spirits of women, they are nuanced. They are flexible. They don't necessarily conform to the strict schedule that a masculine spirit would do really well with. Like men and the masculine spirit does really great with, I'm going to wake up at 4 and I'm going to do this and then I'm going to go to the gym and then I'll do this. And like building it out that way is really beneficial for the masculine. And our world is very masculine. And so women have been taught that's how you need to do it. When in reality, the feminine spirit is more like what you were describing as, I have a goal today to at some point meditate. Like that is
Mm-hmm.
my intention. God, I am setting my intention for the day is to at some point meditate. And if we keep our eye open for that, God will show us like, here's your moment. This is the time. And like, it'll probably be different every day because our circumstances are different every day. You would think that there would be more routine in raising tiny humans. They make things different every single day, no matter how well we try to plan, right? And I think part of that is beautifully divine in that it helps women connect with that feminine side of God because we don't have a choice. Like the masculine side is not going to work when we're raising children. So yes, I love that. And I think it's so important. And all of this requires a little bit of healing because again, we've all been raised in this particular way, women especially, where
Yeah.
it's like, this is the way that you do it. You have to read your scriptures every day. You have to say your prayers every day. Those are great intentions to set and then give it to God and let God show you how that actually works in your everyday life. It's going to be different. One of the things that this reminds me of is the idea of proactively stepping into keeping our covenants as opposed to retroactively not breaking our covenants.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I mean by that is that usually when we talk about keeping our covenants, what I think we actually mean is I'm just going to not break my covenants. I'm not going to sleep with somebody else's spouse. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna not pay my tithing or whatever, when in reality, we could switch that around. And I love how you were talking about being proactive with what you're doing. So instead of saying, well, I'm just going to not break my covenants, we start saying, God, how can I sacrifice? What part of my heart am I still not giving you? What wounds do I have that I haven't consecrated for you to heal them? Do you have any thoughts on like changing our perspective about covenant keeping in that way?
Oh my gosh, I love that you brought that up. And I think that is a huge game changer when you approach your covenants that way. And I think that's a really great way to summarize what I feel like this shift has been for me, because I think you spend a lot of those early adolescent years, you're trying to stay temple worthy, right? You're trying to remain clean and pure. And then you come into this era of you're married, and now, yeah, maybe it's not going to be this huge temptation to go sleep around and break those big covenants. But what does it look like to get, again, to say nitty gritty? Like, what does that really look like on a day-to-day basis? And so I think for me, it's been such a fascinating thing to study these books that I've read, because there is such a huge curiosity to know, what is my dad doing? What did he experience when he went to the other side? Um, and Joseph Smith said something about how this is actually a topic that we shouldn't feel weird about researching. We have so much interest in knowing what comes next, because if we know where we're going, right, it comes back to that idea of vision, then it really tells us what we should be doing. And so in some of these books and things that I've read, it's been really eye-opening to me to understand it's less about um, ticking the boxes and the big commandments, because those are almost like they're naturally going to happen when we understand the principles and we understand, what does it mean to love God? What does it mean to keep these covenants? And what does it mean to be covenant people? And so it's shifted for me to where it's like, I've just thought there's this checkbox that's going to get me into heaven. And it really comes down to, what kind of a person am I being? And how much am I bringing Christ in? And how much am I aligning my will with his? And I think for me, that's been the challenge, is I don't always align that. I feel like I'm this resistant natural man. I have to beat it down, and I have to just keep these rules. Otherwise, I'm going to go to hell. Not really. But I think it's the small things, as I've read, of the intention behind it and how you treat people. And it's less about the big moments of, where are you going to move? What job are you going to take? And really, what impact are you going to have when you're there? And what kind of a person are you being on a day-to-day basis? And so for me, I think the difference in keeping covenants by not breaking them, and choosing to be more in alignment with just keeping them, honoring them, is to first understand them. And so I've loved that the temple endowment and just the way that we study the gospel has shifted a little bit, because these things that just all ran together are now being broken down, where I understand there are five laws, there are five covenants that I'm specifically making. And so for me, I've been really fascinated with learning, what does that mean? And I love that it's really broken down into more understandable language too, to where I'm like, oh, okay, so if that's what that means, then how am I showing up day to day? How am I being kind? How am I not speaking evil of other people? And how am I being honest in everything that I do? And so I think applying all of those principles to everyday actions, I'm actually going through a phase in life right now. I'm really frustrated with how far I feel from Christ. Whereas before it was like, oh, I'm doing pretty good. Like, I go to the temple regularly. I do all these things. I check, right? And now that I'm getting into more of the heart of it, of what does that mean to actually align with God, to actually align with my covenants, I have so much work to do. And
Hmm.
I'm trying really hard not to move into the shame of, you are so broken. What's the matter with you? And it's a really interesting process to root that out from deep within, and not just go be nice on Sundays and appear to be keeping your covenants, but then really go home from church and talk bad about everybody. Or, I'm not saying that I do that, but those are just simple examples of what does that really look like. So yeah, I think for me, it's been getting into the smaller things and not even just the big things, zooming way, way in and being honest with myself. What are my thoughts and what are my actions, and how are those actually in alignment with these covenants I've made and these promises that I've made?
Mm, beautiful. Thank you. Well, and you remind me of, I like to listen to near-death experiences. And I think that it's so beautiful to see the universality of God that welcomes home their children from all walks of life, right? Like our heavenly
Yeah.
parents are there. Christ is there for people who never believed in him. And they die and they go to this place of perfect love, to the point where like the shame and the guilt and all of those things are wiped away. And they just realize like, oh my gosh, I've been this loved this entire time. And yeah, I think that it's really interesting. There was a guy that I listened to who had a pretty intense near death experience. He actually didn't go to that place right away. His life had been characterized with fighting the good things, fighting love, fighting light. And so he went to a place of darkness and he was surrounded by demons. And it wasn't until he cried out to Jesus that he was taken to him, and he went immediately. Like, this was a guy who was an atheist, like had fought God his whole life, and he was immediately taken to the Lord. And he had this incredible experience of being wrapped in his arms and that perfect love. Didn't matter that he had been an atheist in his life, didn't matter that he didn't have a good understanding of theology, didn't matter that he wasn't LDS. Um, he was still taken to that place, and he asked the Lord and said, Lord, this is so beautiful. Because it harkens back to our own faith tradition, is he said, which religion is right? And you just hear echoes of Joseph Smith saying, which of all these churches is true? And the answer that he got was so fascinating. He said, whichever religion brings you closest to God.
Hmm.
And God being that love, like that place of all encompassing, perfect, shameless love, that is what our inheritance is. And there are different ways to get there for different people. And some people might get closer to that love by being a Buddhist than they would by being a Mormon. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important for us to have a more expansive view of God in that way. And it helps us to keep those commitments that we've made. It helps us to keep our covenants, to see like, oh, these things are a progression and I'm learning. And the ultimate goal, like you said, is for me to get to a place where I both experience and embody that kind of love.
Yeah.
And our framework and our theology is helpful to the degree that it helps us as individuals do that.
Yes, absolutely. I just went to a family wedding and it was a non-temple wedding. And my husband and I were talking on the drive home about there's been such a beautiful shift where 15 years ago, if I hadn't gotten married in the temple, I would have felt so ashamed. It would have just been like super uncomfortable. And I felt like I was so proud of both parties. I was proud of everybody for just owning where they're at on their journey. God was mentioned in this ceremony. There is definitely not, you couldn't say like, oh, well, they're not active in the church. They're not pursuing that. And so they just don't even have any light in their lives, blah, blah, blah. You know, things that you might have historically heard people categorize those who have left the church or stepping away from it. And I was like, that was just so refreshing. I felt like the overall feeling there was just love and acceptance and true charity, true Christ-like love. There was not this like, oh, we're going to go and pretend we're supportive. And then when we leave, we're going to talk about how, oh, we wish that they could be this and this and this, you know? I'm like, that's just such a huge relief to me because I think now we're getting a little bit closer. It's come with a lot of challenge as the church itself is trying to shift more into this principle and less rule, but it's having really beautiful results. I think it's bringing families together. There's so much more acceptance. And I think we are understanding now what true Christ like love means and what that looks like in action. Like I was saying, not just in principle, but in actual action. And so I think it's really exciting and really wonderful. And I love, like you, I've read a lot of those stories and I've been really, it's been eye-opening to me to feel like, and I had a conversation with my mom recently where I have a couple sisters who are not really on the path right now. And I said, it's still amazing though, because in dad dying, they are still reaching. They're coming back. I have one sister particularly coming back to Christ, wanted nothing to do with anything of faith. And she's coming back. And, you know, there's some concerns about like, well, but she's not really like coming to this church or she's not pursuing it this way. And I said, any way to Christ is the right way to Christ.
Mm.
And if that were the case that we all had to be members of the church, there would be so few people with Christ when this life is over. It is not about that the way we think. The church is there, and I love how you said that, right? Like these principles of the gospel serve us as long as they are taking us to Christ. If they
Mm.
start to remove us by making us hostile or prideful, then they're actually doing the opposite. So we have to be really aware of that and very careful about how we utilize our religion and our faith in the spiritual pursuit of coming unto Christ.
So beautiful. Thank you. Yes. And that's where people get really uncomfortable with
Mhm.
this feminine spirit, right? Well, like with this ability to not to step outside of the rules. It's scary. And like people get really concerned because there's this fear of, well, what if I get deceived, or what if I mess up, or what if I get it wrong? And like, first off, we all get it wrong. Like, we're all getting it wrong right now, like real time, getting it wrong. Welcome to it. We all have an imperfect understanding of God and eternity. We have so many veils that cloud our vision. I think that we have a lot of fear when it comes to being deceived. Just get rid of the fear, accept that you are deceived, and move on to step 2, right? Like, we are in that place right now. But I think that there are ways that we can approach this growth of moving from like the strict religious kind of pharisaical approach to life to a more spiritually fluid, accepting, loving way of becoming like God. And that has a lot to do with remaining rooted in Jesus Christ, which is your ministry. So, can you talk a little bit more about developing unshakable confidence in Jesus Christ to the degree that I know He's got me? And like that means I can go crazy places. Like I can go where He tells me to go. I can draw outside the lines, especially as a woman, right? Like this is feminine spirit, is outside
Mhm.
the lines. So tell us a little bit about how do we do that? How do we remain rooted in Jesus Christ so that we can make this journey and not have fear along the way?
Hmm. Oh man, such a loaded question. And I will, I guess, lead into a little bit of how I got there personally. And like I said, it's been multiple different experiences, but there's one, and this is basically the introduction to my book. This is a very huge core story in that book that's going to be, we'll probably have ours coming out about the same time. But there was a time in my life where, like I had mentioned earlier, I compartmentalized my faith. I even got to the point where I wasn't sure how to pray because I'm like, how much does God need to be involved in my business pursuits? And there was a lot of fear of, we're not supposed to seek wealth. We're not supposed to seek these things. I have a very strong opinion about that now. That's very different than when it was before. I was so afraid to be worldly. I was so afraid to get it wrong. And I love that you talked about that because that is the Pharisaical approach was very much how I lived my life. Like very judgmental if you didn't do what I was doing
Ditto.
because I'm doing it right. Yeah.
Same.
It's great to come slowly to the other side. I'm still definitely working through that. But I worked my butt off to create some pretty substantial success in the business world and was making a lot of money. And I was actually, in some ways, quite unhappy. And I was at a point where I wanted to just step away from all of it. But I had to keep going because it was the main provision for my family. And well, like fate stepped in and basically just crumbled that thing to the ground. And I had really come to Christ and said to him, I want to know you better. And I know that one of the ways that I can do that is to basically lose all of this. And I didn't want to. It was with a lot of trepidation that I said that. And I knew the moment that I had that prayer and that thought and that conversation with Christ that I might be in a little bit of trouble. Um, but it happened. And one of the huge things that came of that was the exact thing I asked for was coming to Christ and having him show me who I was. Because at that point, my identity was so rooted in accomplishments, in income, in titles, and on the outside, what people saw of who Kirsten Tyrell was. And when you strip away some of those outer labels, for me, I was left with an identity crisis. I didn't know, what am I supposed to do now? Like, what are people thinking about me? And what do I think of myself? And there was so much shame and there was so much self judgment. And it went on for a while. And there was a significant moment where I had been aligned with a company and I was supposed to be at a conference. And because of everything that happened, I wasn't at the conference, but I was watching on social media everything happening. And there were women receiving crowns. And I was like, man, I'm fine not being there. I don't actually want a crown, but I feel like I have failed and I feel like I don't know who I am and just everything felt very broken. And I don't remember what led me to this, if I was seeking it out, if I was searching any of these keywords, but I came across a talk by Elaine Dalton where she talks about remember who you are. And the significant details of that talk towards the end, she was speaking about a prophet who introduced his wife as his queen. And it even specifically said crown, like her white hair was her crown, and it was her wisdom and her sparkling eyes. And I was so aware in that moment that God was telling me who I really am. And it was a little bit of this moment of like this little, silly nudge of, I know you're bugged that you're not getting a crown, or you feel like you should be getting this crown, but let me show you what the real crown is. Let me show you what you're working towards. Let me show you who you are to me. And it changed everything. And I went from this very worldly classified identity and started piece by piece discovering who I really am. And the confidence, I mean, I've been at one point had a podcast called Contoured and Confident. Like I was in the beauty world. I was like, that's what leads to confidence, right? Like feeling comfortable in your body. And I think that's an element of confidence. I think that that's a beautiful thing. It just started to transition to where I had to ask and really identify, what does it mean to be truly confident? And so this year, as I've gone through this loss and I have really started to look back at a couple months ago, all of a sudden the stories and all the things that started to come together where I was like, there's a pattern here. There's things that God's been trying to teach me. And I have felt like a confident person throughout my life. I've had confident moments. I'm a performer. I have a podcast, right? Like I'm not shy, but I don't think the opposite of shy is confident. I don't think the opposite of confidence is necessarily, I don't know, self-loathing. But I think true confidence comes from knowing who we are. And I think when we understand that who we are is a daughter of God, we say this young women's theme throughout our years if you're raised in the gospel, right? And it's changed a little bit throughout the years. But it's funny and ironic that we basically have this affirmation of stating who we are as daughters of God, and then we go through life and we forget, or it gets put on the side. And we know this. We go sing, I'm a child of God. We hear our children, we're teaching them these truths. And I noticed that I didn't really act on that. I wasn't acting like I believed that I was a daughter of God. And so as I have continued to grow and learn and study, what does that really mean? I've recognized that every single time I've had true confidence, the unshakable kind, where you can throw darts at me, you can call me names, you can tell me that I can't do something. The times when I'm able to stand in full confidence is knowing and claiming that total truth that I'm a daughter of God. What does that mean? A God, the God of the universe who created everything. I'm his daughter. I'm one of his creations. What does that mean? Do I really believe that? Do I believe I'm capable of creating? Do I believe that I am capable of big dreams? And it just changes everything. And so I think sometimes we tend to build our identity and our confidence on sand, right? Like the foolish man and the wise man. And to me, it's the rock is Christ. The true anchor of our confidence is him. And when we take the time to ask him who we are, when we take the time to understand what divine identity really, really means, then it changes the way that we show up in every aspect of our lives as mothers, as business owners, as wives, as people in our ward, as daughters. Like all of those roles become just roles and not necessarily the identity, because everything is rooted in this. And I love that President Nelson gave that talk recently, making sure that we understand the most important layers of our identity. And that first one is that we're a child of God. And so I think when we can really ask that question, do I believe this? And what does that mean for me? And how does the daughter of God show up? And what is the vision for a daughter of God? Then everything changes all the way down to your behaviors and your habits. And it's a really cool, but very long process, depending on how long you've claimed old identities and how long you've believed all of the different labels that you've taken on throughout your life and all of the lies that Satan wants to chuck your way. And it can be a really beautiful process. It can be very quick and it can change everything. And you'll just apply it over and over and over again as you encounter every new life experience with that lens. But man, it's so powerful. And I now show up in my life, and yes, there's fearful moments, right? There's moments where I have some self-doubt. And anytime I come back to that, I do vision writing every single day. And I have an I am statement. It is I am a fearless and unshakable daughter of God with a divine identity and an inherent worth. And when I state that every single day, then every experience I encounter with that truth looks very different than it would have before, where I was a house of cards and it could crumble. And if somebody said the wrong thing, then that was it. And this goes the opposite too. You're built up by the praise of men. You're built up with these accomplishments, these achievements. Those can be gone at any time. Your physical body, you could lose a limb, you could lose functionality in your body if your identity is on a body that looks a certain way, and that changes, then who are you? And you have to know who you are at a spiritual level. You have to know the you that is residing within this body, that is engaging with this life, because that's who we really are.
Mm. Yes. And even beyond that, I've been going through this kind of process too. I think that there are layers to it, right? Like we start off as children and we kind of start to understand who we are, and then we grow and we learn more and more and more. And lately God has been showing me like this is who you are in like a really big way, like in cosmic ways, and it's shocking.
Mm-hmm.
um in a lot of ways, but it's been so cool at the same time. It's been so powerful. And one of the things that I feel like I've learned, and this is Meghan, so like no one take my word at this. Like you can think about it for God, but even just what you were saying about our spirits residing in our bodies, I like one of the things God has been suggesting to me is like maybe it's the other way around. Like maybe our bodies are actually just a small part of our spirits that are this cosmic, multi-dimensional being that's outside of space and time, and we're embodied at just like a little bit of us, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and so even that is like totally flipping on its head the way that we think of like actually I am so much bigger than just my body and just my life circumstances, and that's the person that I want to know, that's the person I want to remember. I was saying this to a friend of mine recently. I said that God has been helping me remember myself, and I think that that's really important too, that like this isn't just you cultivating your identity out of fresh air, or like you choosing what kind of shirt you want to put on each day. Like this is about having veils parted so that you can see the truth of who you are that has always been, that is
Yeah.
eternal, that is so much bigger than just how we relate on a day-to-day basis. So I
Mm-hmm.
love that. Thank you for sharing those truths. And this kind of fits in with I love a framework that you have mentioned in your book called the T.R.U.E framework about how to become rooted in Christ. And identity is a key part of that. Really quickly here, can you overview the other parts of that framework for those of us who, again, like we're trying to figure out how can I cultivate my spirituality and go where God needs me to go while remaining rooted in Jesus Christ? And I think this is a great framework for that.
Yeah. Well, and this really came from a compilation of different things that I've studied, some of the Buddhist culture, and I've really sought truth in so many different places. And this is really what it comes to, right? Is how do we find what's true? Because we live in a world where there's a lot of truths. We have our own truths, we have subjective truth. And so, how do we make this relationship personal with Christ? How do we really know who we are? And how do we start to claim that identity and make it very personal? And so, for me, it's been recognizing that a lot of this is rooted in our stories, and they're true stories. There's things that really happen to us, right? They've shaped who we are. We've had people actually tell us things about who we are. And so how do we start to create some awareness of those experiences and to find God's truth in it? And I think it's really interesting because you could write this side by side. You could have, here's my truth, here's what happened, and then we start to identify God's truth. So the framework is an acronym. I love a good acronym. I love a good alliteration. And so T is to track your thoughts and behaviors. Like start to just create awareness. Like, what am I thinking about myself on a day-to-day basis? What do I believe about myself? What is the constant theme that is running through my head? We have what, like 90,000 thoughts a day, but a lot of them are just the same core thoughts repeated again and again. And so when you start to bring a little bit of awareness to that and you track those thoughts, then you can start to get curious about them and you examine them and you start to R is recognize. So recognize the worldly labels and the beliefs. Where did this come from? Where did this belief come from that I am this thing, or that I think this thing will happen if I do XYZ? And maybe what experiences did I have that led to that? And what does the world believe about this? What is the world telling me the truth of what it means to be a mom? What is the world telling me? Even some of my culture telling me about what it means to be a mom who has a business or works. And so where did that start to stem into a belief? I love the Inside Out 2 movie because it's these experiences, right, that form
Oh my
beliefs
gosh, I
and form
cry.
these.
I
I
cry.
know. It's
Watched it
so
twice and I've
good.
cried both times. I'm like, this is embarrassing.
I
Anyway.
know. I had to leave. I feel myself when it gets to like the build up. Everybody in my family loves to giggle because I cry very easily. And I just left the room towards the end when we recently watched it, but I sobbed the first time. And this is really fundamentally that, it's these experiences that start to shape beliefs about who we are. And so recognize that and start to trace the story back, trace the thought back. And then we can have this experience of uncovering. So you is uncover the divine identity, uncover the truth. Start to say, what would God say about this situation? How is he looking at me right now? When I did this, when I committed this sin, when I said that thing, when this person said this to me, what would God have been saying in the corner? Like, what was he trying to say to me? Devil and angel on my shoulder. What's his truth? And this might take work. This might take research. This might take you really understanding what it looks like to study scripture and to study the words of prophets. And this is really, in my experience, where it came to having that experience of finding that talk. That was God's truth about who I was, right? I had to first be aware of the thought that I'm not worthy of this. I haven't accomplished anything. I'm not successful. That was the truth that I had. And then the worldly labels and beliefs was, if I don't have this label, if I don't have this success, if I don't have this paycheck, then I am worthless. And then now let's ask God. Let's uncover his truth. Let's see what he has to say about me. And then the final one is E, which is embrace. Embrace that true self, because it feels like it should be enough to hear what he says about us. But if we just resist that, I mean, this is the full encompassing work of the atonement, right? We have to let it go. We have to hand it over to him. We have to choose to believe what he says about us. It's not enough just to hear nice words. We have to fully immerse ourselves in his truth. So if you do those things, you can take anything that's causing you pain, contention. And I would argue that when you do this, when you're willing to look at a story objectively with God's truth, that you can remove suffering immediately. Immediately. Like, it's so fast. It's a process, it's work. But I have found that if you apply this to every single thing that's causing you discomfort and pain, if you're willing to do that, if you don't want to sit in the pain, then the transformation is immediate. And then the work after that is just application. Okay, now what does it continue to look like to embrace that true self? How is she going to show up? How is she going to engage? What is success going to look like moving forward? So yeah, that's essentially the framework and how it applies to that specific story and how it can apply to anybody.
Thank you. This is a beautiful feminine form of repentance that you've
Yes.
given. I get a little bit, it like just irks me a little bit when we go through the 5 steps of repentance. There's a lot of truth there. That's a very masculine way, I think, to look at it. Is
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I just got to do this and then I got to do this. Like that's a very masculine way to do it. The feminine way is much more as you're showing, it's much more subjective, it's much more individual, it's heart deep, it's subconscious deep. Like, this is hard work, what we're talking about. Like,
Yeah.
it's not the easy thing to just be like, oh, I have this false belief and that's why I'm behaving this way. Like, you have to go into the shadows of yourself. We did a really good
Mhm.
episode recently with um Catherine Sontag, who wrote a beautiful book about Heavenly Mother and how Heavenly Mother includes the roots of the tree of life. And like, you have to go down into that darkness.
Yeah.
And it can be scary. It can be really hard to go to that part of yourself that is veiled. A lot of the times, if we experience trauma as children, our brain literally puts a veil. And so we don't see it. And we grow up and we have these behavior patterns and it's like, why do I even do this? And it's because there's something back there that your brain is trying to keep you safe from because it hurts so badly, but like, you have to go there in order to
Yeah.
see it and give it to God, as you were saying, and heal it, and
Mm-hmm.
disassociate from it and say, that's not my identity. That was something that happened to me. I am no longer going to be defined by that. This is really hard work and it's
Yeah.
deep work, but it is real. And like, if you wonder how you can be repenting more, this is a great place to start, of
Mm-hmm.
evaluating those thoughts and wondering, starting to peel back the curtain with the Lord and whatever resources the Lord will lead you to. He might lead you to weird places that are different kinds of healing modalities that maybe you haven't tried before. But you can trust him. You can trust him as you apply this framework to remain rooted in him, that he will help you peel back those layers and see things as they are so that you can be converted and be healed, right? Like, that is ultimately what the Lord wants to offer us. And did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I felt like I was doing a pretty good job of this, right? I'd studied some things, and then really soon after my dad died, I went to a retreat and I met somebody who she's developed an entire framework for emotional intelligence coaching. And my spirit knew, I'm like, this is why I came to this. I need this. So I went through the coaching and now I'm certifying to be a coach. And it is like putting it into action 10x speed, right? With I now have these tools that I can apply, and the T.R.U.E method comes into that a little bit, but there's so much left. Like you said, there's a lot of work to be done. And it's not enough just to have the awareness. It's not enough just to explore. There really does have to be a way of completely reframing that identity and enforcing it and putting it into application. And so this has been really powerful. And I will say, like, it is ongoing. I feel like there's so many big things. As I went through 12 weeks of coaching, I would come to every call and be like, oh my gosh, guess what I discovered? Guess what I unearthed from these crevices of my mind? And I now understand why I'm doing this, because a lot of times we want to attack behavior, we want to change our habits, we want to become better disciples, right? And we're not looking at what goes way below the surface, which is a lot of these identity layers. And even still, I recently discovered like this whole layer of things that I was suppressing, and this whole way that I was showing up in my life. Even you and I having this conversation is actually, it is significant timing, because for a long time I had this identity, this belief in who I was, that I had to have this double life, that I was this really good Mormon girl over here, but oh man, if people knew like the things that I had done and the skeletons in my closet. And so I have really held back from even showing up on podcasts like this and bringing the gospel and bringing my faith into things, because it just felt too removed. And so in acknowledging that, embracing that, and that just happened in the couple of weeks since we've had to reschedule, that's super powerful. And there's tools that you can apply. There are so many different ways that you can start to go through this. And it's what God wants for us. He didn't just send us down here to muddle through it. He wants us to come to him. And it's going to look so differently for all of us. But this really is a catalyst to so much joy and so much peace. I now no longer feel like I'm sleeping through life. I'm not just showing up and I don't know what's going to trigger me, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I do get triggered. And oh my gosh, I just fell apart and yelled at my kids. See, I knew that I was this monster. I knew that I was this person. I'm able to apply tools and have a framework that helps me to become and show up as the mom that I've always wanted to be, as the woman I've always wanted to be. And that's huge. That's so powerful. So I just want to reiterate, yes, it is a long process, but not to make it sound miserable. It's beautiful. It's joyful. It's so much fun. It is so strengthening, and nothing will bring you closer to Christ than when you are willing to hand this over to him and put it on the altar. Somebody pointed out recently, have you noticed in the temple how many times we come to the altar, and we were like, how have we never noticed the significance of that? It is over and over and over, time and time again. And when you have tools like T.R.U.E or whatever, you just get to apply it. You get to practice and flex those muscles again and again until slowly you start to realize you are becoming that version of yourself that God knows you already are. And it's so fun.
Thank you. Yes, I am reminded of the image of Jesus Christ as the hen, the mother hen, and
Yes.
all he wants to do is gather his chicks. And we don't go. We don't go because we're holding on to this hurt and these beliefs and these dynamics that are just not serving us anymore. Maybe they did. Like maybe I think that more often than not, it does serve us in the beginning when we're developing as children to hide those things from us. But we get to the point where we're adults and those things are no longer helping us. And all Christ wants us to do is to come unto him. I love that you talked about him as the rock. And I was thinking about the progression of the temple. The temple is a progression. It's meant to build. It's not that we're getting all of it at once. I mean, we do, right? When we go through the endowment, but it's meant to be teaching us a process. And Christ is there throughout the whole process. We see this in the ancient Israelite tabernacle too, when you talk about Christ as the rock that we're supposed to be building ourselves on. Well, where was the rock? Well, the rock was the altar of sacrifice in, in the tabernacle, in the area of the congregation, that space. And then you pass into the holy place and there's bread. And I think about Satan who tempted Christ, turn these rocks into bread, right? Like it elicits that imagery. He's there. And then when you go into the Holy of Holies, there is a rock that is covering this well that goes into the underworld, basically, that goes into hell. And he is sitting on top of it. And he is the way to the throne, that we stand before the throne of God, of our Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother, as if we are built on that rock. But he's there the whole time. And so I love these tools that you've given us and the stories that you've shared to help us illustrate, like, it is possible. We can move into this higher law. We can become people that are driven not by the checklist of things, but by the spirit of them. And we can become more integrated. We can live our religion in a way that is safe because we know that Christ is there every step of the way. So thank you so much for
Yeah.
everything you've shared today.
Of course. Thanks for the beautiful conversation. We went places I didn't anticipate going, but I loved everything that we've talked about. You're so great at bringing out the things that need to be shared. And I do totally have faith that the people listening needed to hear these insights to hopefully apply them to their own lives, to have a little bit more of maybe an awakening and awareness. I hope that more of us will wake up. I know that's a little cliche. We've been hearing like, we need to wake up, we're living in a crazy time. But just even in small ways, I hope that we'll continue to be aware that we are free agents. We are not to just be acted upon, we are to act. And so, what does that look like for you? Just wake up, be a little bit more aware, do a little bit more each day to have that relationship with Christ be personal, and it will make a world of difference. It will make life so much more enjoyable and so full and so much fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kirsten.
Thank you, Megan.